So the second part of activity 4.6 has us solve the equation that we had previously solved graphically by using the quadratic formula. If you recall in the last video, we solved this equation by graphing both sides of the equation. So our y1 was maybe the 1000 and our y2 was this right side of the equation, or vice versa. Perhaps this was y1 and this was y2. And the intersection gave us the answer. And I believe we came up with about 14 years after 1990, we'd have 1,000 motorcycle deaths. But we can also solve this equation using the quadratic formula. Okay, and if you look down in their book, they give us a formula here, right? They tell us x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2a. Now this only applies when we have a quadratic equation in this form, right? ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So if you take a look at our original equation, this is not equal to 0. So to put this into standard form, I'd have to subtract 1,000 from both sides to leave me with 0 on the left side of my equation, right? I want to get a 0 on one side of my equation. So let's do that on some scratch paper. Here's my original equation, and I'm going to subtract 1,000 from both sides. So once I've subtracted 1,000 from both sides, you'll see I'll be left with 0 on the left side, and the 791 minus 1,000 is negative 209. Now we're ready for our quadratic formula, but we have to identify the parts, the b and the a and the c. That comes from this equation, right? So the a would be the 6.875, the b would be a negative 80.76, and the c would be the negative 209. So I've identified here in line 2 my a, my b, and my c. And then step 3 will have me substitute these values into my equation. So when I substitute my a in for a and my b in for b, notice the parentheses, right? I've added all these additional parentheses to help you enter this into your calculator. Right? That's the trickiest part of this for students I've found is not coming up with the formula, but actually entering it properly into your calculator. So I'm going to take out my calculator and I'll display what I've done, and maybe you want to take a moment to really just take a look at the use of the parentheses. Here's my calculator, and another thing to note, remember this is the negative sign. Right? On your calculator you have a negative key down here and a subtraction key, right? So when I start out with a negative 80.76, make sure you use the negative key and not the subtraction key. Now when you get to this 80.76 squared minus 4, make sure you use the subtraction key down here, okay, and not the negative key. All right. So you can see I have my open parentheses, and I've typed this exactly the way you see it with the use of parentheses. And then the last thing to note is make sure that this last parenthesis is on the outside of your radical sign. Especially for the newer calculators, you want to make sure you have this distinction. Right? So when you finish this second to last parenthesis, press the right arrow to make sure you're outside of this radical sign. Okay. Once we've entered everything, and I'll scroll to the end of this equation, you can see, right, when I get to the division part, right, we're going to divide all of this by 2 times 6.875, and I put that in parentheses. And again, some might say, Mike, you really got carried away with the parentheses. But I just wanted to do that to make sure you see that I'm isolating the numerator and the denominator. Okay, I press enter. And I get 13.956, which is what we got when we graphed this, right? Also notice, I only use the plus sign here, right? This equation says plus or minus. Right, so we have our answer for the plus version. If you press the second key and the enter key, it brings up the last thing we were working on. So I can just press the back arrow and change the plus sign to a minus sign, or the subtraction sign, and that will give me my second case, right? Because we're going to have two answers, right? The plus or minus will give us two answers. So here's the plus. I'm going to change that to subtraction, and I'll press enter. Oops. Okay, so there's my plus. I'm just going to press the subtraction key. So now I have my plus and my minus. I press enter, And that gives me my second answer, negative 2.209. Okay. So the answer that we're looking for is this 13.956, right? 13.956 years after 1990, we should have 1,000 motorcycle deaths. And again, this matches what we found when we graphed the problem. Right, if you remember, when we graphed the left side of this equation and the right side of the equation, we ended up with the intersection occurring at 13.927. So we'll just call it 14. Right? So that's us using the quadratic formula to solve this equation. And we've also done this graphically by graphing both sides of the equal sign and finding the intersection. So again, here's a more formal answer, right? Our model predicts it will take about 14 years after 1990, or we can just call that 2004, for the number of motorcycle deaths to reach 1,000, right? And again, we solved this equation to come up with that answer, right? We knew the number of deaths was 1,000. We had to solve this for x or for t to come up with the number of years after 1990 to get to this 1,000. In the next video, we'll try another problem where we'll solve using the quadratic formula.